It's funny how with these huge historical events, these things that just reshape the world, it's like it's sometimes hard to imagine them actually ending. Like, the war just goes on and on and on and on. I came across this quote that just nails that feeling. It said, the war couldn't be over. It had been on for years. Nobody would believe it could finish. And you just think about how deeply ingrained this whole global conflict had become for the people who lived through it.
Absolutely. For people who just lived through years of this relentless war, to even imagine it stopping must have been, I don't know, almost like stepping into a fantasy. And I think that that disbelief, that sense of how can this actually be over, really speaks to the war's just total psychological impact, as much as all the immense physical destruction that it caused.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're going to dive into today. We're going to take a close look at the armistice that ended the fighting, at least, of World War I on the 11th of November, 1918.
Mm.
But we're not going to just stop at the moment the agreement was signed. We're going to look at, the reactions, the disbelief, the relief, and that understanding that, this armistice, while a huge turning point, it didn't just instantly bring about world peace.
Yeah, exactly. And to try to understand this moment, and it was such a momentous occasion, we've got some really powerful firsthand accounts from soldiers and civilians that were preserved by the Imperial War Museums. And these personal stories just offer such a vivid glimpse into what it was actually like on that day and the days that followed. And we're going to also examine some historical analyses that help explain why an armistice, just the stopping of the fighting, was pursued as opposed to a complete surrender.
Yeah. So what we want to try and do is really help you understand the impact of this event, unpack some of the nuances, maybe reveal some surprising facts, and help us all sort of discover those aha moments that can really illuminate how complex it was to end such a devastating conflict. So to understand that moment on November the 11th, maybe we should take a look at, like, what actually led up to it. What was the situation like before that moment?
So by the autumn of 1918, the situation really for Germany and its allies, it had become incredibly unsustainable. Their armies were just exhausted, and they were facing, significant defeats on multiple fronts. At home, the civilian population was suffering from some severe food shortages, which was
Sure.
leading to a lot of unrest, even some instances of rebellion. And, seeing all of this as early as late September, German General Erich Ludendorff, he really concluded that they had to seek an end to the fighting.
So things were really bleak, and I was reading that they actually first reached out to the United States, to President Wilson. Why go to him first?
It's interesting, actually. The Germans, they were trying to be quite strategic in their approach here. They really hoped that Wilson, with his 14 points, advocating for a peace without victory, they hoped he might offer them some more, favorable or lenient terms for an armistice. Whereas they were pretty sure that Britain and France, having endured so much on the Western Front, would probably demand some far harsher conditions.
Yeah, that's pretty shrewd thinking on their part, trying
Yeah.
to play the diplomatic game and see if they can get the best possible outcome in that situation. But in the end, Wilson, he didn't actually lead the armistice negotiations, did he?
No, he didn't. The armistice negotiations were actually firmly under the leadership of the Allied commander-in-chief, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, and he was pretty clear that the terms had to be strong enough to prevent Germany from being able to, restart the war. The Allied powers were in a very strong position by this point, and they were determined to secure a pretty decisive end to the fighting.
And wasn't there something that Germany had to do internally as well?
Yeah. As a condition of the armistice, the Allied powers insisted that Kaiser Wilhelm II had to abdicate and that Germany had to establish a new democratic government. And interestingly, this kind of worked out well for the German military command. They were quite eager to shift any blame for the defeat away from themselves and onto this new socialist government that had just been formed.
It's almost like they're trying to control how history was going to look at them, even while the war was ending.
Yeah.
So, all right, the armistice is agreed upon, finalized at 5 a.m. on the 11th of November, but the fighting doesn't actually stop for another 6 hours. What was going on in those crucial few hours?
So the agreement actually stipulated that the cessation of hostilities on the Western Front would come into effect at 11 a.m. that day. And I think partly this delay, it was down to the just huge logistical challenge of getting the order out to all the different units that were spread out across the whole vast front line. Just getting that order out and coordinating it across a war zone, that took time.
And we even have an account from John Boone, who was at RAF headquarters, and he actually received a telegram detailing the cessation, don't we?
Yeah, we do, and it's a really stark message. So it arrives at 8:05 a.m. and it just reads, "Hostilities will cease at 11:00 today. Ack, ack, ack." Now, ack back was the code for a full stop, so it was a very, very definitive end to that message. But yeah, the telegram also included instructions that, no military operations should be started
Yeah.
that couldn't be completed by 11 a.m. and no aircraft should cross enemy lines after that time.
So it was a pretty clear, unambiguous order. But it seems like the way that the news was received and the impact that it had immediately varied quite a lot, didn't it? There's an account from William Gilman. He was part of a marching column when the news was formally announced. And I remember reading that and being struck by like the lack of any celebration. It's like nobody really reacted to it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation, actually. And I think for a lot of the men on the front line, this news, it didn't trigger like instant elation. They were often quite isolated from broader news, and they were probably also just too exhausted or maybe even too conditioned by the years of fighting to to really believe that it was over. Gilman, he actually even mentions that they had heard rumors about the war ending before, so I think there probably was a degree of kind of cautious skepticism in the air.
Yeah, it makes sense. Then we have Bertram Nyland, who was in Paris, and he actually got the news through broadcast from the Eiffel Tower. And it highlights that, the news traveled in different ways, but there was still, even when it was very public, there was disbelief amongst his fellow soldiers.
That's fascinating, actually. This real contrast. So, in a big city like Paris, the news it's being broadcast publicly, and there's this immediate sense of awareness and, as we know, widespread public celebration.
Yeah.
But for those who were still actively serving, especially in maybe more remote areas or directly on the front lines, the reality of the armistice, it often filtered through more official military channels or even just unconfirmed rumors until it was formally verified.
And then there's George Jameson's unit. They literally came across a sign that just said, "The war's over," and their first thought was, no way, that can't be right. That feeling we were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah.
Like just so hard to grasp after so long.
Exactly. The war had become their reality, so the idea that it could just be almost felt, I don't know, like a cruel trick or something that was just improbable. And even the sign itself, it was probably marking a previously used headquarters or something. It's almost indicative of how kind of haphazard the way this monumental news could reach those who were right there in the thick of the fighting.
And it's tragic that even while the news of the armistice was spreading, fighting was still going on in some areas right up until the very last moment. Jim Fox has an account of a sergeant who was killed just an hour before the armistice came into effect. And it's a reminder that, the war didn't just sort of gently fade away. It went right up to the very end.
Yeah, it's a really poignant detail, actually. To have survived since 1915 and then be killed so close to the end of hostilities, it underscores the randomness and the cruelty of war. It's a reminder that even in those final moments, the danger was still so real for so many people.
Yeah. And then there's William Collins, who, as the fighting stopped, he was near Mons, which is where he had started his service in the war.
Mm-hmm.
And it just seems, symbolic, like the conflict had come full circle for him.
It really does, doesn't it? And his description of the thick fog that was hanging in the air and the silence that followed, like years of constant noise, it's just such a powerful image. It's a moment of just complete stillness. Not only the end of the fighting, but also the beginning of this long process of coming to terms with what had happened.
Yeah. So we've seen how the news traveled.
Yeah.
And the initial waves of disbelief. But once the armistice started to sink in, how did the soldiers on the front lines actually react? Because we have a whole range of responses documented, don't we?
Yeah, we do. And I think that just highlights the complex emotional landscape. I mean, after this prolonged traumatic experience, people reacted in very different ways. So you've got someone like Tom Adlam who expresses this consistent belief in Allied victory throughout the war. For him, the armistice was maybe a confirmation of what he'd always believed.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, there's Harry Hopthrow, and he has this account of the cavalry, wanting to keep fighting even after the news had arrived. It's almost surprising. It's like they were so into the fighting that they wanted it to keep going.
Yeah, it is quite surprising, isn't it? And perhaps for the cavalry, they'd experienced less of that static, the trench warfare that was so characteristic of the Western Front. And so maybe for them, there was still that sense of wanting to see the fight through to a more definitive conclusion. And I think it speaks to the just the very different experiences of the war across different branches of service and just the different motivations of individual soldiers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Then you have like Charles Wilson. He's the one you kind of expect. Big celebrations,
Yeah.
wants to drink immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. For many, the overwhelming feeling was just relief and just this powerful need to celebrate being out of danger. And I think just the thought of enjoying these simple pleasures, sharing a drink with your comrades, it must have been incredibly powerful after years of deprivation and constant threat.
Yeah, but then you also have someone like Clifford Lane, and for him, the armistice was almost like anticlimactic. Like he was just so exhausted physically and mentally that he couldn't really feel anything.
Yeah, and I think Lane's account, it's a reminder of the just incredible physical and psychological toll that the war had taken on so many. I think for a lot of soldiers there just wasn't any energy left for cheering or celebration, just this deep, quiet sense of being drained and just thankful that it was over.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's Herbert Cooper. His initial reaction was disbelief.
Yeah.
Just like we've heard from others. But it was only when he actually saw the terms of the armistice,
Yeah.
the German fleet being sent to Scapa Flow,
Yeah.
the surrender of all those weapons, that he finally believed it. And then he had this dream about the war restarting. It just shows how deeply affected he was by the whole thing.
Yeah. The actual concrete details. They were the undeniable proof, weren't they, that it really was over.
Yeah.
And Cooper's dream, it really illustrates, I think, how difficult it was to mentally transition from a state of constant conflict to one of peace and security.
Yeah. Arthur Dunton, you could almost feel his relief in his account. He just said, "Job over and well done," which
Yeah.
is, after years of fighting in places like the Somme, Passchendaele, that must have been a powerful feeling, right?
Yeah. I think Dunton's perspective really highlights the sense of futility that a lot of soldiers they came to feel during the war, particularly on the Western Front. The lack of any real progress despite huge casualties, it must have made the armistice feel like the overdue end to this long and ultimately kind of stagnant struggle.
And then there's G. Spicer, and his reaction was to just sleep for 15 hours straight, which, I mean, that says it all, right?
It really does, yeah. It's almost like the body and the mind just reach a point of shutting down after just enduring so much stress and fatigue.
Ruby Orr's reflection is really interesting. She focused on the loss of life and how the armistice made the finality of deaths really hit home, maybe contrasting with those big celebrations that were going on back in England.
Yeah. I think Ord's perspective, and she was a member of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, it offers a really valuable insight. I think for those who had been, supporting the war effort, the end of the fighting, it probably brought this really stark realization of the permanent absence of loved ones, and that might have really tempered any immediate sense of joy.
And then Lloyd Fox, he reminds us that even as the war ended, there were still casualties. He talks about a soldier who was killed by a stray shell fired by American troops who were celebrating, which is, darkly ironic.
It's really sobering, actually. It's that reminder that even in moments of celebration and relief, the potential for tragedy was still there. And Fox's account really highlights the chaos of those first few hours after the armistice. And, it's that unfortunate reality that for some, the war still had one last cruel twist of fate.
So while all of this is going on at the front, this whole range of emotions, what was it like back home? Because we hear about Harry Forrester, who had quite the celebration in Lille, I think involving a bit too much to drink, but luckily he got away with it.
Yeah, Forrester, he really captures that sense of release, doesn't he? And just this overwhelming need to celebrate, even if it meant, breaking a few rules and indulging a little bit.
There's Malcolm Hancock in Sierra Leone, and his story really shows how global the conflict was and how long it could take for the news to travel. And even then, they still had a huge bonfire to celebrate when they finally heard.
Yeah, the delay in the news reaching, more remote parts of the world, it really highlights the global scale of the war and just the logistical challenges of getting information around. And then, their bonfire, it just shows this universal sense of relief and the shared understanding that the end of the war, it mattered to everyone.
We also have Bill Hayne, who was in Italy. And for him, the news was actually a bit anticlimactic because Italy had already signed an armistice. It's an interesting contrast to the lack of joy that we were hearing about from the Western Front.
Yeah, it's almost like the impact of the armistice was very closely tied to what individuals had served and and what they'd experienced. The Western Front, it had really borne the brunt of that really intense, prolonged fighting against Germany. And so the end of that specific conflict probably had a very, very unique and complex meaning.
And then you get these amazing descriptions of the crowds in London. Mary Lees, she talks about Kingsway just pouring into the Strand, people climbing on top of buses and breaking the railings in their excitement. And then Winston Churchill, he talks about the streets, which were normally empty, suddenly just filling up with people, bells ringing, just chaos everywhere. It really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It does. Those accounts, they just bring that extraordinary outpouring of emotion to life, don't they? These huge, spontaneous gatherings, the bells ringing, just this overwhelming sense of a city letting go after years of restrictions and anxiety and loss. It must have been incredible to see.
And it wasn't just London. It was happening all over the UK. We got Harold Boughton at a POW camp in Lee, and even the prisoners there were joining in the celebrations. Maisie Nightingale was riding around on lorries with flags in Southampton.
Yeah.
And Harry Smith in Sheffield, he talked about factory hooters going off and people dancing in the streets. It sounds like the whole country just breathed a sigh of relief.
Yeah. These widespread celebrations, I think they really demonstrate how much everyone wanted peace. The factories emptying, the sirens, the street parties, it all points to this shared feeling of liberation and hope for the future.
But it makes sense that not everyone was swept up in that initial excitement, right?
Yeah.
William Chapman, he was in a hospital ward, and his response was actually very subdued. He talks about this sense of unreality amongst the wounded officers.
Yeah, I think Chapman's experience, it's a reminder that for those who had really suffered the physical and emotional wounds of war, the end of the fighting, it didn't automatically mean happiness. The pain and the trauma, they were still very raw, and the future was probably quite uncertain.
And Wilfred Littleboy, he was a conscientious objector. He was still in prison. And his account shows that, even though there was this cautious optimism, they knew they weren't going to be released immediately.
Yeah. I think Littleboy's account, it's really important because it sheds light on the experiences of those who had opposed the war, on moral grounds and had been imprisoned because of that. And, while the armistice offered the prospect of freedom, they were very realistic about the fact that it wouldn't necessarily be immediate.
Bert Ferns has this kind of funny story about how he found out about the armistice. He was a POW in Germany, and he just saw his guard reacting to the word "Waffen stillstand," which is just German for armistice. It's a lighthearted moment in all of this, right?
It is a bit of a later moment, and it shows how news could travel in the most unexpected ways. It's that universal understanding of the significance of that one word, even though, the prisoners themselves, they didn't understand it at first, but the guards' reaction, it said it all.
And then George Fox, he actually witnessed the surrender of the German High Seas Fleet, which he described as a pitiful sight. It's a different kind of reaction. It's more reflective, focusing on the defeated enemy rather than the celebrations.
Yeah, and I think Fox's perspective, coming from someone in the Royal Navy, it highlights the scale of the German defeat and the symbolic significance of their fleet having to surrender. It evokes that sense of the human cost of war and how it ends for everyone involved.
And Basil Fair, he was in Nottingham, and he actually felt sad rather than celebratory. He was thinking about the loss of life, which really echoes what Ruby Ord was saying earlier. That feeling of remembrance kind of overshadowing the joy.
Yeah. And Farrer's reaction really underscores just the deep impact that the war had on everyone. For many people, the relief was mixed with grief, with mourning. They were remembering those who weren't coming back. And even the Prince of Wales, he went to Notre Dame Cathedral to commemorate the losses.
So we've heard all these different reactions, but I think it's important to understand why it was specifically an armistice, a stopping of the fighting and not a full surrender from Germany.
Yeah, and it is a key distinction. You see, by November 1918, both sides, they were just utterly exhausted. They had both suffered incredible losses. Over 8.5 million military personnel had died. And for the Allies, While victory seemed certain, invading Germany, I mean, it was seen as incredibly costly, both in terms of, resources and in terms of maintaining morale. It was just this huge challenge. Guy Cuthbertson said it best, really, Berlin is a long way from France. And so the Allies, they wanted peace with victory as quickly as they could get it, and an armistice was the way to do that.
And on the German side, their situation was also just awful.
Absolutely. I mean, their military was falling apart. There was political turmoil back home, and the civilian population was starving because of the Allied blockade. Their allies were also collapsing and asking for peace. So they were facing, complete defeat, widespread famine. And so they actually started reaching out for an armistice at the beginning of October.
And they tried to go through Wilson first, hoping for some better terms based on his 14 points. But in the end, they had to go directly to Foch, the Allied commander-in-chief, right?
That's right. And Foch, he was acting on very clear instructions from the Allied governments, and he presented the Germans with an armistice that they couldn't negotiate. The Allies, they were in a position of power, and they were determined that Germany wouldn't be able to start the war up again. So the terms, they were harsh, but they were designed to do exactly that.
So even though the Germans weren't happy about it, especially the parts about disarming, they really didn't have a choice, did they?
No, not really. I mean, they were worried about a communist uprising back home if the military completely collapsed. But, the alternative, to keep fighting a war they couldn't win or face an invasion, that was probably even worse. So they signed the armistice in the early hours of November 11th.
And those terms, they were pretty huge, weren't they? They had to pull out of all the territories they'd occupied, surrender loads of their weapons, give Alsace-Lorraine back to France, and let the Allies occupy the Rhineland. It was a big defeat, even if they didn't call it a surrender.
Yeah. It basically took away Germany's ability to fight, at least for the foreseeable future. On paper it was a ceasefire, but in reality it was pretty much a surrender.
And I think it's important to remember that the armistice wasn't the end of everything. It didn't just suddenly bring peace to the whole world.
No, definitely not. The fighting stopped on the Western Front, but similar agreements had already been signed with Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary. But the actual peace treaties, the ones that officially ended the war for everyone, they weren't signed until the next year, 1919.
And even then, even after the treaties were signed, fighting continued in different parts of the world. It's kind of shocking that even though the Great War was supposed to be over, for a lot of people, the fighting and the suffering just kept going.
Yeah. The big battles might have stopped in Western Europe, but there were still a lot of nationalistic and revolutionary movements that hadn't gone away. And in some cases, the war had actually made them worse. For example, you have the Russian Civil War, and that actually killed more Russians than World War I did. And then there was the Irish War of Independence, the Greco-Turkish War, all happening around the same time.
And it's interesting that even though the scale of these conflicts, they weren't as big as World War I, there were still a lot of civilian casualties. It's like we focus on 1918 as the end, but for so many people, the violence just kept going.
Yeah, you're right. And these later conflicts, they were different. They were smaller, but they were often about deep-seated ethnic or religious tensions or social and economic inequality, which, led to a lot of civilian casualties. And even when they tried to make peace, like with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which led to the great exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey, that caused huge suffering and displacement for hundreds of thousands of people.
It just shows that the impact of World War I, it went way beyond 1918, way beyond those peace treaties.
Exactly. The armistice was a huge step towards ending the worst of the fighting. But it couldn't just erase all the problems that had led to the war, or all the new problems that the war had caused.
And one of the biggest things that led to Germany wanting an armistice in the first place was that collapse of morale in 1918. What were the main things that caused that?
Yeah, there's this fascinating chart that the U.S. Army put together at the time, and you can see, there's this initial wave of enthusiasm when the war starts in 1914, but then it just steadily declines, and then in 1918, it just absolutely plummets. And there are a bunch of reasons for that.
Like what kind of things?
Well, you have to remember, years of trench warfare, the constant threat of artillery, machine guns. The Germans had this weapon called a Minenwerfer, a kind of trench mortar. And that was especially terrifying because it was so sudden and destructive. And then there was also this growing resentment among the ordinary soldiers because they felt like the officers had it easier, better food, better conditions. Even things like, tobacco became important. Allied soldiers, they had a pretty steady supply, things like Princess Mary's gift box, they had cigarettes in them. But German soldiers, they were running out of tobacco. They were smoking stuff made from dried leaves.
And that was because of the British blockade, right? That must have been awful for morale back home as well.
Oh, absolutely. The blockade meant food shortages, people's lives were getting harder, and that really affected their support for the war. And the German government tried to counter this with propaganda. They had the Hindenburg program, which tried to make the enemy seem less human. But, people were still hungry. They could still see how bad things were getting.
And then there were the military defeats.
Yeah, the Germans tried to use unrestricted submarine warfare, thinking they could break the Allies, but it backfired. It actually brought the United States into the war in 1917, which was a huge blow for them. And then when Russia pulled out of the war, there was a brief moment of hope. But then they started having problems in the territories they'd taken from Russia. There were strikes back home, soldiers were deserting, and Allied propaganda was starting to have an effect.
And then the spring offensive of 1918, that was their last big push, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Kaiserschlag. They tried to break through on the Western Front, and they did have some initial successes, but they couldn't keep it up. They lost a huge number of men, especially their best troops. And then the Allies counterattacked with the 100 Days Offensive, and that showed that they had the advantage, both in technology and strategy.
So, when you're fighting a war, you have to believe that you can win. And when that belief goes,
Exactly. If you don't think you can win, it becomes almost impossible to keep fighting. And then you add in the Spanish flu, which was devastating in 1918, weakening everyone. And you can see why morale just collapsed. Soldiers were surrendering en masse. They were deserting.
and that led to Ludendorff admitting defeat in September, and then their other allies started collapsing. There were mutinies in the German army and navy. It all just fell apart, leading to the Kaiser stepping down and then the armistice.
And sadly, this collapse of morale, it also led to the stab in the back myth, where they blame the defeat on internal enemies like socialists and Jews, instead of admitting that they had just been beaten. And that myth, it was used by the Nazis later on.
So as we wrap this up, what are the key things you want our listener to remember about the armistice?
I think it's important to remember that the armistice, it wasn't just a ceasefire, it was a really complex event. There was relief, of course, but there was also trauma, a sense of loss. People were starting to realize that the war ending wasn't just this one moment, it was a process, and it was going to have consequences for years to come. And the stories that we've heard, they really show how different people reacted to the news, how human and personal it all was.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And on that note, here's something to think about. When do you think World War I truly ended? Was it that moment of silence on the Western Front at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918? Was it when they signed the peace treaties in 1919? Or did the effects of the war last much longer? The question that makes us think about how long the shadow of that war really was